as well. Okay, welcome to the second half. Now we are going to talk about social structure. We are going to go deeper into social structure. And let me just cut here and share my screens. I will screen my share with you. Okay, so I think you have visual. We will go deeper into social structure now. Now, when we talk about social structure, we talk about family, and we talk about social hierarchy, and we talk about special groups within that social structure or that community. So when we talk about family, family is really the basis of the social structure, because you form families with individuals and you form the society with those families. Now, that has been the backbone of societies in lots of human civilizations. And the definition is that we have a nuclear family, the family that is composed of the mother, father, and the children. And then we have the extended family, which also includes grandfathers and cousins and all the other people. So when we see this culturally, it actually depends on how the society sees the family, because in, for example, Western cultures, sorry, uh, in Western cultures, the nuclear family is the basis, because the culture itself revolves around individuals, and this is as much family as you want to get, because after some point you go and have your own family, and these are two separate families. But in generally in Eastern cultures, the family is a much larger social structure. So you have families and you have grandfathers and you have children and you have grandchildren and stuff. For example, this is still so in Turkey or in Eastern countries. But the interesting thing is, it was also like this in Western countries as well, because family is not just a sentimental structure in societies, it's a functional structure, in the sense that when you think about how societies are formed in the first place, we talked about this last week. We talked about the first person planting a crop and then building a house, and then other people coming around and forming a village, and then building a city and having a city state, and then multiple city states battling it out, one of them becoming the victor and forming a kingdom and going into territory. And then we talked today about how that territories created feudal systems where the lords of the cities ruled certain patches of lands in the name of the king, and then how it toppled down after the feudalism fell with the invention of gunpowder and cannon. Now, within all this structure, there is one thing that really dictated how societies operated, and that is resources. Because, pardon my handwriting, resources are crucial for survival. And how humans started to dominate the flora and fauna, asserted their domination, is through commanding of resources and the knowledge on how to use those resources. So resource in terms of supplies, food, energy, water, this is a very important concept, and this in turn created the concept of material possession. So I built this, or I gathered this, or I made this, I raised this, and this one is mine. So you cannot take it. This is my stuff. When you think about it like that, the control of resources turning into personal possessions, or in this case where we are coming at is family possessions, is very important, because that is how you control the resource. And since everyone is going to die, everyone is mortal, the passing on of these resources, of this created wealth, to which people, who you pass it on to, is very critical, because imagine from an ancient individual's perspective, or even today's modern individual's perspective, you work very hard at something. You work honestly, or maybe you work dishonestly. It doesn't matter at all, but you obtain control over certain resources, and you don't want your mortality get in the way, basically. And you also have offspring that you uh, emotionally care about for the welfare of, and you naturally want these resources to go to your offspring, because you want them both to continue your legacy, to continue your success. It is your own thing, and it is for their own welfare as well. So this transfer of resources, transfer of wealth, is actually what led to the structure of family in societies, to the definition of families. And which is why, this is exactly actually why some extended families could be very, very extended in certain senses. Let me just look at this. We are going into family actually. So it is what dictated family in the past was not sentimentality alone. It was the control and transfer of wealth. So, how is family formed? How is a family formed? So, for example, the structure of a family, uh, mechanically or physically, is directly related to how you reproduce. The duration of pregnancy might require parents to stay together during the term of pregnancy. uh, the period that the baby requires care might require the parents to stay together for a certain amount of time, and the effort required for the baby's care also might require it. So if you have a species that lays eggs and then just leaves the eggs around and don't care about them anymore, you don't have the need for a family. You have the need for mating, reproduction. But that species, if the young can care for themselves after they come out of the egg, of course, they wouldn't need parenting, they wouldn't need care, and then that society might not need a family structure. It might be every individual for themselves. But for example, in the case of humans, and this is very interesting, let me just find it. Where is Here it is. So in the case of humans, it was because when we first lived in trees as primates, and we came down and we started to walk upright. Now we went from four legs mode to two legs mode. We became bipedal, and this gives us an edge over other animals because we had hands now to use spare things. But this created a shorter pregnancy period for humans, because now the human standing upright did not have the necessary pelvic structure to support the baby for longer. So basically, we stood up and we weakened our backs, and thus humans could not carry a baby in pregnancy as much as they could anymore, which resulted in babies being born in a state that required more care than an animal would. So a human baby has no chance of survival whatsoever when they lose their parent. And this required the parents to stick around and to care for the baby. And then this required the parents to form a bond then, because it wasn't just 1 or 2 weeks of caring for the baby, it was years of caring for the baby. And this created the nuclear family structure. And then it went on from that point. This is how human families are formed. It has a very important biological background to it. We have families like this. Uh, but for example, in certain tribes, a child is a child of the tribe. So it doesn't matter which woman or which man the child was born from. This child is a child of the tribe, and the entire tribe cares for the child. This is a tribal structure, tribal family structure. And interestingly, today we might find it horrific, but if the tribe's numbers are large enough, any babies that are born are discarded because this baby is not viewed as an individual. It is viewed as a part of the tribe, and the tribe doesn't need another baby at that point. So, sad as it may be, this child is gone. This is, for example, a tribal family structure. But as society progressed, as I said a few minutes ago, the accumulation of wealth and the transfer of wealth started to play an important role because people started to have things, people started to have an understanding of owning things, and then they started to worry about who was going to own these things after they are gone. And the natural answer is the child or the family in this case. Because here, for example, interestingly, let me just check my slides again. Uh, this is interestingly where lots of the thing about incest is coming from. Because when you have incest, especially for example for kings, the lineage stays inside. You don't have someone coming from the outside and having a child and then that family claiming legitimacy on your throne, for example. When you marry brothers and sisters, you effectively keep the dynasty inside the family. There is no other blood that can come and challenge you later. This is a very practical approach. So when we say today incest is a taboo, but it wasn't so in the past, it had a practical reason. In today's modern world, we see emotions and sentimentality as very important things, but actually they are things that are important for the past 100 years. Before 100 years, before 1900s, emotions and sentimentality or love in marriage, for example, were not important. They didn't need to be present. When a woman and a man were betrothed to be married, they were not expected to love each other or they were not expected to like each other even. That is a new concept for us. So to marry for love was basically non-existent. I mean, of course, the urge to reproduce and the sexual urges that it creates, and then the emotional attraction that it creates were real, but they were not the basis of marriage as we perceive it today. It was literally a social contract as to who keeps what in terms of someone rich or someone who owns something dies. That was what the family is. So, when we think about the social structure, when we think about the form of families, we have, for example, two things that we can consider. How do we track the family? How do we track the lineage? So, patrilineal families is the lineage through father. So, you basically check the family through the father. So, you check every child's father and who sired whom, and this is the father's side. Again, sorry about my handwriting. And then you have the mother lineage. So you check the mother's lineage, and who you are, which family you belong to, depends on your mother. And for example, in Jewish societies, as a religion, Judaism imposes that if your mother is a Jew, you are a part of the society. If your mother is not, you are not. So that is lineage through the mother. Patrilineal is lineage through father, and this is generally what we more or like less see around the world. And that also has another practical reason. You keep lineage through father because it is very easy to know who one's mother is. You see a woman walking around pregnant, and then you see or hear the woman having a child, and you are definitely sure that the child belongs to that mother, that woman, because it is a process that the entire society witnessed through individuals. But you cannot be exactly sure who the father is because there is no way to check that. There's no way to track that. So it is checked through a social structure. You announce the child, you accept the child, and everyone also accepts that the child is yours. And then the child becomes yours, and you have the right to pass on your resources to that child. And bilineal tracks through both mother and father. And then there is the concept of leading the family. So archaeality. Patriarchy means the society family and in turn the society is led by males, and matriarchy is the idea that the society is led by females. Now, in our world, for example, in Draws of the Underdark in Forgotten Realms setting, it is a strictly matriarchal society. So the female drows are the head of the family. They make all the decisions. They rule the society, and males are actually seen more or less like just ways to reproduce. They are there as assets. They are soldiers. They are husbands. They help produce the children. But beyond that, they are not important. That is the drow society, for example. In our world, we mainly see the patriarchal societies led by males, and there's actually a very nice, very good talk about families. I will send it to you. Here it is. And this little portion, this woman is a professor of anthropology, I believe. And this is an interesting talk about matriarchy, for example.
You're going to say matriarchy?
Yes, I do have questions about the matriarchy, if that's all right.
Absolutely, go for it. Now,
sorry.
I was just going to launch onto matriarchy.
Please, launch away.
And say matriarchy is a really interesting idea, and sadly, it's not real.
Huh, really?
I know. People love to fantasize about it. Now, what is interesting is that you do get matrilineal societies, that is to say societies where you reckon kinship through the female line and the male line is not very important.
Right.
But that doesn't mean, sadly, that women have the upper hand. They can be matrilineal but not matriarchal.
Interesting.
And to my knowledge, there is no society ever in the world, ancient, past, or present, that is matriarchal, where women actually run things.
That's so interesting. And again,
interesting.
That's something that so many people like to think about, and it's fascinating that this is not actually, there's no models of this. I would like to apologize, incidentally. There's been a little bit of cat shenanigans, so now you can see my wall instead of the tapestry. I will try and fix that in the very short break that we'll be having in a few minutes. But yeah,
I was just going to say on matriarchy. Matriarchy was a very popular idea invented in the 19th century. Very interesting, by a German scholar called Bachofen. And he postulated, he had this very evolutionary view of societies as going from like primitive savages to matriarchy to patriarchy, which was the highest evolutionary form of society. Yes, quite. Needless to say, we don't believe this anymore.
Right.
So
it's not only teleological,
some kind of evolutionary stage in the kind of teleology, as you say, that led to patriarchy. Most social scientists and historians and archaeologists and anthropologists do not believe this. And this got all tangled up with lots of ideas about great mother goddesses. And you do get these kind of female figurines, which may or may not have anything to do with divinity, that show up in prehistoric societies.
Sure.
And people just took those and ran with it in the wrong direction.
Right.
So, for example, this is a very interesting take on the subject. So that a woman is a professor in anthropology, but the idea that a matriarchal society is popularized to pave the way to glorify the patriarchy is actually a very interesting concept. So that guy, what she said is that basically this German scientist guy said we were savages, and then we went to matriarchy, and then we came to patriarchy, and this is the ideal, most perfect form. So this is clearly some attempt to glorify this. But historically, when we see our species, for example, then we realize that we don't have matriarchy in human societies. So this doesn't mean, of course, it didn't exist in pockets anywhere, maybe. But what we will think about, what this shows us actually, is how culture in certain areas in history can shape the perception how individuals or some ideas can shape the perception of that culture. So we always think about it that way. Uh, so this is not, we will talk about history in the upcoming lectures, and none of this is separated from history in that sense. The culture changes and evolves in time, and it changes and evolves with the times. So in any species you create, any cultural motifs that you create for the past of the culture, of that community, can be different or evolved to the present of the community, as in the case of swastika as a symbol. So then the family is also important, that it is a power. We already talked about in possessions, so I went ahead of myself and talked about it already. But it is very interesting that family is also a power in numbers, because in ancient societies, the for the beyond the past 200 years maybe, there was no police system in societies. There were soldiers, but their duty was to fight other soldiers in battles. Soldiers did not uphold the law. The law was there, but basically there was no one to enforce it. So a judge, for example, can decide when two families come together. When where is my okay, here it is. When two families have a debate, for example, over a piece of land, over or over murder of someone, when two families have a debate and a judge rules about something, oh, you are right or you are right, there is not actually any way to enforce this. There is not an enforcing force. So what this family has to do is to take the matters into their own hands based on the ruling. Now, you can go against the ruling, of course, and that creates blood feuds and such, but that also destroys your reputation maybe. But if the judge says that you are right and you are entitled to something, maybe compensation, maybe blood by killing a member of the other family, but you must have the numbers to enforce it actually. You have to be sometimes a force in itself, an army in itself. So that's why the family as a power was also important. And we already talked about possessions, the distribution of possessions or the inheritance. And for example, in Greek cultures, I think, ancient Greece, the females, the women owned the land, but the men operated it, run it. So the men managed the land, but the possession of the land was in women. So when a woman married, her lands went with her. And you can see how this creates a marriage dynamic to marry women into power dynamics between families, or the reason to marry people within the family. So if you have some way of sophisticated wealth transfer system, and you don't want to lose the wealth, you have to find a way to keep it inside the family. And there's also, for example, the concept of androgyny for that sense. Androgyny is one woman having multiple husbands. So this is not something you see very often, but it did exist in past societies. And mainly, again, they talk about this in the full talk of the clip I just showed you. I will link it to you as well. But basically, the reason is all men have children from the same woman. These are generally brothers or so that all the children stay in the same family. So that it doesn't come from another family, and this child doesn't belong to another family as well. The bloodline, when this woman marries into this family, stays inside the family. And we see other aspects of this in the future slides. For example, this one, other concepts. So the levels and names of kinship is very interesting, because, for example, in English, when our mother has a sister, we call it aunt, and when our father has a sister, we call it aunt as well. So Peter's Aunt May is not actually his mother's sister, it's his father's sister. The same goes for uncle. Father's brother is uncle and mother's brother is uncle. And we know very well that it is not so in our society. Mother's sister is teyze, father's sister is hala, and May is Peter's hala, May hala. But in Western societies, it's because it is the level of hierarchy in the family that matters. So you have your father, for example, and this is you, and this is your father, and this is your mother. Let's put it like this. So your father's brother is on the same level as your mother's brother. They are all on the same level of hierarchy from you. So it doesn't matter whose brother they are because you are a family unit as an extended family, and these are your uncles, for example. So in that sense, in many ancient families, your cousins are also considered your siblings because they are on the same level as you. So, and for example, that's why they all have the name cousin, but they then denote the level. This is my second cousin once removed, third cousin thrice removed. It means how far away it is from you in the social hierarchy, literally. But for example, in Turkish language, we have names for each of them actually. Amca kızı, amca oğlu, hala kızı, hala oğlu. We specifically tell what kind of a cousin they are. But for example, in other countries, in Western countries, it didn't exist because, as I said, family as a power source, a powerhouse was a power in itself, and it didn't really matter in which part of this hierarchy that person resides. Actually, even actually, when if your father dies, your uncle could take the role of your father. It could be your father, or even in the concept of ghost parent, and this is a very interesting concept. For example, a man marries a woman, but he dies before he can have a child. And then the man's brother comes and he doesn't necessarily marry the woman, but has a child with the woman, and this child is legitimately considered to be this man's child in the eyes of the society. So the uncle acts as a surrogate father and then gets out of the picture, and this deceased person is considered the father of the child. And now, when we talk about the transfer of wealth, you can actually see why this happens. Because for preserving the family wealth and preserving the family power, this person needed to have a child so that the child can have a claim on his possessions. So the brother steps in and produces a child and then steps out, and the child is considered to be a part of this nuclear family. This is what a ghost parent is, for example, and it's a very, again, interesting concept. There's another concept called fictive kin, and fictive kin is the thing that we see in godfathers. So you in Western cultures, two people have a child, but then another person comes and he undertakes the religious education of this child. And he says, I will look over this child, and this becomes the godfather. And that is a fictive kin. He is not a blood relative, but he has another sort of connection to the family and to the individual. So we can invent all kinds of other concepts of ourselves about families, about our own species. So these are an example of what we have on Earth up until this point, how it evolved into the families that we have today. And let me just look at this. Now, after family, we come to social hierarchy. After family, we have classes, and there are basically three main classes in human history. These are the ruler class or the nobility, because they are generally interchangeable. The nobility rules because they are noble. And there is the clergy class that deals with the spirituality of the people, that communicates with whatever god they have for them, shamans or priests, whatever, or imams in case of Islam. And then there's the soldier class. The soldier class are the people who first said, okay, we cannot grow any crops, but we will protect you. And you will give us crops in return. And it is generally seen, especially in feudalism, that these three classes has risen above the others: nobility, soldiers, military, and clergy. Of course, it doesn't have to be this way in any species that we create. But this is, again, as I say, what we have in our human history. And then we come to social status. Apart from the classes, we can have social status. It can be based on physical properties. For example, when you see someone taller than other people, it commands a feeling of respect. So everyone wants to be taller. Everyone adores taller people. Especially in our societies, when a guy is taller than the others, he has a sense of stability about him. Or, for example, a deeper voice also commands some sort of respect among other people. And there are even people faking their voices to sound deeper like this so that they can command more respect. The best example is the CEO of Terra. What was that? There was a woman who fooled the entire medical industry. She, yeah, hmm yeah, yeah, yeah. For example, that story is she claimed to create a very easy, non-invasive test, blood test that could be done on site because it generally requires laboratories. And she claimed that she developed this technology and she was building it, and she became the superstar of the innovation industry or medical industry. She was on the cover of every magazine. And it was later discovered that she was a scam. But other than that, that's not the important part. People realized that she was deliberately deepening her voice during her talks so that she could be taken more seriously. So, another thing is level of education. We see people with more education, we perceive them to be as more valuable members of the society. So, this might not be your worldview. I'm not saying it is. But in our society, in Western societies or in Eastern societies around the world, that level of education means some effort put in. And in eyes of other people, it creates a sense of value. It doesn't matter if you how you had access to the education, if it was because of your wealth, if it was because of your status in the first place, but the level of education creates some sort of status for you. So wealth can create social status, as we all know very well, and we all know how that works. Birthright is what you are entitled to socially because of your parents. So this is where all this racism comes from, basically. So in and and now you can see actually how birthright affects all these things because of the transfer of wealth. Uh, because of your parents or your network, you may have to very different set of resources than your peers, and you can have better level of education, you can have better wealth, you can even have better physical properties because you have the time and resources to work out. Very simple. So this is, for example, in human societies, is what decides how successful, not decides definitely, but gives people a leg up, let's say. And we can have social statuses specific to species. For example, an insectoid humanoid creature might be very favorable if they have longer antennae than the other members of their species. When you look at the tails of a reptilian species, the color of the tail or the length of the tail might create social status. Or, for example, for a magical species, the level of magic they can command innately might create more value for them. And then we have special groups. For example, these can be guilds, and guilds can be trade guilds or profession guilds or other guilds. And how this works, how this came to work, is actually in the Europe, especially in Europe, uh, as we talked about cities and other stuff. For example, let's say you have someone who trades there. You have a trader. And then you have another trader here. And then you have another trader. We have three guys. Now, naturally, these traders compete with each other in terms of prices and resources. And that can, in some instances, create instability in prices. Prices can fluctuate, etc. Everyone loses. But when these guys come together and say, let's have a consensus about the prices that we will sell things with and the prices that we will buy things from. That is very important. So when these guys come together and decide to work together for the good of all of them, they form a guild. And this is what happened in history as well. Traders started to join their forces, not their money, but their forces, and started to decide the prices for the things they will buy and they will sell. And this gave them actually an immense amount of power, so much that they became, I cannot write for the life of me. I didn't mean to, but they became opponents, or they went head to head with nobility. So the ruler class or the clergy class or the soldier class could not ignore this guild anymore, the power of trade. Now, what that created is you have a traders guild and they all decide that they will buy shoes for 5 gold pieces. Now, I'm talking in D&D terms. Gold piece is a D&D term, a monetary term. Now, let's say, yes, gold piece is a good one. But if it costs 4 gold pieces or even 6 gold pieces to make a shoe, and all the traders in the city agree to buy it just for 5 gold pieces, you as a manufacturer, as a craftsman, are at a huge disadvantage because they can set a price as they like. You cannot set the price as you like. So what happened is the shoemakers also started to come together and form their own guild to battle the traders guilds. And this, okay, thank you, Sea Cleaner, for notifying me. This created the profession guilds. So now we have 2 sets of guilds: traders who buy and sell things, and craftsmen, profession guilds, who create things and want to sell them. And this is also the start of unions, by the way. But then this created some other things. For example, in a city, if you're a shoemaker and there's another shoemaker and there's another shoemaker, you don't want just anyone else from another city to come in and disrupt your operation, because you joined forces against other guilds and you are looking out for yourself. But then there comes this guy and starts to sell a shoe for 4 gold pieces because he just wants to cut prices. And then you have to fight against him too. And you maybe send him out of the city, maybe you kill him, maybe you do something else. I don't know. But what happens is, so you need the profession guilds approval to work in the city now. And that creates apprenticeship. I cannot still write. So I want my child to be a shoemaker because shoemaking is a very profitable business. It is prestigious and they make a lot of money. So I take my child to one of the shoemakers and tell him, can you raise my child as a shoemaker? And if the shoemaker agrees, my child becomes an apprentice. And then he is raised by the rules of these people, these shoemakers, and then he becomes a journeyman. This is, why can't I just write properly? I'm not like this in real life, I promise. I can write. I know how to write. So journeyman is the second stage. This is how it goes down in Europe, by the way. It doesn't have to go everywhere like this. But in the end, this child becomes a master shoemaker, and then if these other shoemakers permit it, he has his permission to open a shop and make and sell shoes with the rules that they set, because he is one of them now. So they raise their own guys. They don't just let another guy come from outside the city and just do business there. if he comes, by the way, he has to talk with them and get their permission first to build things, to do business in that city. The same goes for traders. Now this creates a very immense power dynamic within the society, because when a trade group is strong enough, when a profession group is strong enough, they can have some sort of power over the society. And you can see the implications that this makes, uh, as well as these uh, base classes that we have, the, let's say, universal historical classes in human societies. Now we have guilds, and you can see this in all kinds of fiction. The name guild is actually some staple trope in RPGs, but now you know where the name guild comes from and what it means. For example, in Dune, Space Guild has a monopoly over who goes where, because they have the ships, they have the spies, and they have the navigators that helps the ships traverse in hyperspace. So the Spacers Guild in Dune has an absolute monopoly over what moves where and when, and even the Emperor himself has to abide by their rules. He has to rent carriers, pay for it, and move his troops to quell a rebellion or invade another uh, planet, for example. That is, for example, the kind of power that a guild can have when they have knowledge or a resource in their possession. And then we have the religious groups. Uh, and when I say religious groups, I don't mean automatically a church or a pantheon, but it can be a spiritual group as well. But in this, we have levels of organization. So, for example, in the best known religious organization is the Catholic Church in the world. So they have the Pope, and then I think they have archbishops, and then they have bishops, and then they have cardinals, maybe not in that order, but they have a level of hierarchy, and it creates its own dynamic in that hierarchy. And there are philosophical groups. Philosophical groups can be movements, for example, and even though it's just a single line here, they can change the entire history of the world. For example, as far as we know, Christianity started as a philosophical group, and I forgot the name. Socrates' philosophical teachings started as a philosophical group, and it became a philosophical movement, and it actually formed the basis of the European idea and thought of today and the Western culture in that regard. So, I have taken so much of your time, and I thank you for listening. Now we will go into the rather fun stuff. We will do some digging in games. We will see about how it is manifested in games, because all this talk was about games, basically. So, when we talk about social structure in games, we can talk about it in two ways, as everything else in this course. We can talk about it as a piece of the lore that the player will be exposed to but not engage in, or we can see it as a part of a game mechanic that the player will actually do engage in. And let's just go directly into examples. When we think about family, in Fallout series, or let's say the later Fallout installments, Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, family plays a central place in the story, because in Fallout 3, we are in a vault, we are a teenager, our father is accused of some crime and runs away from the vault, escapes the vault, and we have to go after him to find him. And of course, as in all open world RPG games, we completely forget about the main quest line and do all other stuff despite the urgency. But when we look over that point, we are looking for our father in Fallout 3, and it's part of the narrative. In Fallout 4, it takes an even more ridiculous form for me, because in Fallout 4, you are a parent, actually, and your baby child is taken away from cryosleep in front of your eyes by killing your spouse. If you play a female, your husband is killed. If you play a male, your wife is killed. And you go back to sleep and you wake up and you are looking for your child. Now, And then again, you go outside the world and you do completely unrelated things like saving settlements or battling mutants or so. Now, as a parent myself, when I first saw that, when I first that opening title, I was very determined to go through the main quest through the end because I am looking for my child and I don't need any other motivation as a parent. So, and any other distraction in that world looked silly to me because I mean, I have a child that I need to find, and I'm not going to lose time trying to save that 17 settlements over there. I don't care about them, I care about my child. So, for example, in that sense, when you think about the narrative, this is a better formed narrative because a teenager caring about his father doesn't have to be as strong as a parent caring about their child. But for example, this is as a lore, it's in the Fallout lore, but we can have some sort of quasi-mechanical way of it as well, as in Rogue Legacy. Let me just show you the trailer for it. This is a very fun game, and it defined a genre actually. Well, it was back the times when Desura still existed. But in Rogue Legacy, basically, it's the game that coined the term roguelite, by the way, because in roguelike, you lose your progression, all your progression, when you fail your run. But in roguelites, you keep some portion of it. Between runs, you can upgrade your character, and it is a very familiar concept with us this today. But it is the Rogue Legacy that started this. So in Rogue Legacy, when you die, you don't play as the same hero. You play as the child, as a child of that hero, and you have three heroes to choose from. I think it was three, and they all have different traits. For example, you are perma-rided, attacks knocks enemies further. So some traits are positive, some are negative. If you are colorblind, you cannot see the colors in the screen, for example. But the, it is a quasi-mechanical thing. You get a member of your family to continue the legacy, and you build your keep, as in the way we talked about transfer of wealth. So, for example, this is a different approach to family in games. And then you have games that embrace the family mechanic to the full extent. In game 4X games like Crusader Kings and Paradox games in general, you don't rule as a single godlike ruler for all the time of your civilization, but actually you rule as a series of rulers that pass on with heritage. So, and this creates very interesting gameplays in Paradox's games, especially because you can do all sort of things. You can marry your own children, you can marry your siblings, you can uh, kill them off, like in Ottoman empires or so, Eastern empires or so. So, and this also creates very interesting bloodlines. This is, for example, I think this was titled the Ultimate Incest Bloodline, because you see the child marrying his own mother, and it happens here as well. So you can totally do this in Crusader Kings, and not maybe to this extent, but this is something that actually happened in world history, in the geography that this game took place. Let's be specific about that. But great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and all these rulers have different traits, for example, and they can rule their kingdom differently, and this in turn translates to game mechanics. This is also another way we can use family in our games. Now, when we think about social hierarchy, this is one of my favorite games, Dishonored. If you haven't played it, I'm not going to say you should, but you better do, because it is wonderful in terms of art design, world design, open world. It's just the one flaw it has is that it is a bit easy because it tries to cater to all styles of play. But in Dishonored, you are basically play as the bodyguard of the Empress, and you are secretly the lover of the Empress and the father of her child. But for example, that also creates a very interesting dynamic in that regard. Of course, it doesn't create it for long because she is killed in the first 5 minutes to further the narrative. But then again, you have two different social status people here that have engaged in a relationship and cannot form a family because of this difference in social status. But then in Dishonored's world, you see the social hierarchy very well because, oh, this shouldn't have come here. This guy is the master of spy, and he's basically in charge of the soldiers stuff, the army. And this guy is the High Overseer Campbell, and he is the head of clergy in that world. And these guys are Pendletons. They basically represent the nobility. So this trio is there to rule and to take control in the Empress's absence. And this is the first scene almost. So the Empress is killed, and you are accused for it. And these guys are actually there to accuse you for it. And that sets off the narrative. And throughout the game, you battle these guys, not literally. You don't battle because it's a stealth game. So, of course, you can just slash through them as well, but that is not the point. The thing is, you struggle against these. You give your struggle against these trio of power in that world's dynamics, and you try to bring the truth out, or you try to clear your name and find the true killers of your lover or the Empress. But for example, in this would be a very straightforward social hierarchy example. But, and this is important, these two Pendletons have a third brother, and he's rightfully in the background here, because in the narrative, you cannot do this by yourself alone. This is the entire state you're against. So there is, okay, thank you for the animation. There's another group that saves you from prison, that helps you escape, and they want to reinstate the Empress's daughter, your daughter too, actually, as the Empress. And the other group tries to take power by saying that she is too young, and they will rule in her stead until she comes of age. It's a power struggle. But what is different in this here is this guy is Admiral Havelock, and he's basically a soldier. He is the leader of this loyalists group. So he leads the organization, but he is also a soldier. And this guy is Brother Martin from the Overseer organization, and he expects to take Campbell's place when things change. And this guy is the guy we see in the picture in the previous painting. So this one represents the nobility and doesn't like his brothers at all. He's in their shadow all the time. So he conspires against them. So this trio also represents the soldier, the clergy, and the nobility. So, and then as the game progresses, you realize that this power trio, power dynamic, is the same as this power dynamic. These are just two power groups of the same social hierarchy classes that are battling it out and using you as the pawn, for example. So this is, for example, a very good way to put social hierarchy into games, and this is Dishonored in this sense is a little bit sterile. So it doesn't go too much into intricacies. You can see the conspiracies coming from a mile away, but it doesn't make the narrative bad because it uses the narrative very well. It doesn't have very intricate. does have intricate power struggles, but it is, let's say, it is a bit blunt. Well done, but blunt, like a very well-crafted thing that serves a very simple purpose. And then we have guilds in games, and about guilds I will only have something to say about Morrowind and Skyrim, just to compare how it is done in games. In Daggerfall and Morrowind, the previous installment and Morrowind, you have three guilds basically: Fighters Guild, Mages Guild, and Thieves Guild. And you can see that these are profession guilds. They are not trade guilds, because in these games you are not a trader. You can do trade and you can make a lot of money by trading things, but that is not the emphasis of the game. So in Morrowind, by the way, you engage with trading guilds as a part of the lore and quests all the time. But the guilds that you can engage, you can be a part of, are the Fighters Guild, Mages Guild, and Thieves Guild. And in Skyrim, you have companions as the Fighters Guild, you have Mages Guild, and you have Thieves Guild. Now the difference between these two is, in Morrowind, you should know how to cast a spell to be a Mages Guild member. In Skyrim, you do not need to. You just need to know one spell, and then, just as I did, you can put on your full plate armor, take your longsword in hand and your shield, and you go do all the mage quests and become the archmage, which I did. And then you can go to the Thieves Guild, and in your full plate armor, your longsword, and your tower shield, do all the Thieves Guild's quests by killing everyone, not sneaking around like a thief, but killing everyone like a barbarian, and then become the head of the Thieves Guild. And I don't need to talk about the Fighters Guild. In Morrowind, in contrast, the final, if you want to progress in any of the guilds, you have to forsake the other two up to a certain point. So you cannot progress in Fighters Guild to the top if you are a certain level in Mages Guild, for example, because they don't like each other, not because it's not possible. But the final master quest of the Fighters Guild in Morrowind is actually to go kill the leaders of the Thieves Guild, because they have that kind of a power dynamic between them. In Skyrim, there is no power dynamic whatsoever. It is just there as a lore, and you can walk around as the Master Vampire and the Lord of Vampires and the Lord of Mages, Thieves, Dark Brotherhood, and Fighters Guild all in one together. You can be all of them, and that is poor implementation. This is, in Skyrim, it is done so that the player doesn't have to miss out on content. In Morrowind, it is done more masterfully, the way it was meant to be if it was going to be realistic. So thank you for listening to my rant about Skyrim. But it was actually fun to cut through thieves as a fighter. So I know it was a very long lesson. Actually, it is 3 p.m. now. I will stop sharing my screen. Just stop it. So this is it for this week. It was a very long lecture. Thank you for bearing with me for all these hours. And I will stop the recording now. Then we can talk about the lecture if you want.